In the cold, gray morning of a day 10,000 years ago, a hunter in the North Sea basin, a land of rolling hills and dense oak forests, drops a harpoon into a freshwater marsh. He doesn't know that the water he's standing in will one day be 120 feet deep. He doesn't know that the Storegga Slide, an underwater landslide the size of Scotland, is currently priming itself off the coast of Norway. He is standing in Doggerland, a territory that was once the heart of Europe, a country that today only exists in the nets of fishermen. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. For decades, Doggerland was a myth, a Stone Age Atlantis whispered about by North Sea trawlers who would occasionally pull up more than just cod. They found woolly mammoth molars, they found the blackened stumps of prehistoric oaks, and occasionally they found the tools of the people who lived there. Barbed antler points and flint blades preserved in the anaerobic silence of the seabed. But as of February 2026, the myth has been replaced by a higher resolution reality. New data released this month by the University of Bradford and the Submerged Landscape Research Unit has given us a stereo image of this lost world. By combining artificial intelligence with magnetic field analysis, scientists have begun to map 188,000 square kilometers of the seabed, an area the size of England and Scotland combined. We are no longer guessing where these people lived. We are looking at their river valleys. We are finding their Goldilocks zones, exact spots where freshwater met the rising sea, where the land was rich, and where the evidence of their lives is still trapped in the mud. But there is a shadow over this discovery. The core samples pulled from the southern North Sea this year, specifically a sample known as ELF-19, contain a signature of the sinking that should make us all pay attention. This isn't just a story about the Mesolithic past. It is a high-definition forecast of our own future. The chemistry in these cores tells us that Doggerland didn't just drown, it fought for every inch. And for the people living there, the ocean wasn't a neighbor, it was a countdown. Today, we dive into the data of the drowned. We look at the sedaDNA, the sedentary DNA. It allows us to see the very plants and animals that disappeared beneath the waves. And we look at the 2026 climate models that show us exactly how fast a world can vanish when the water stops, asking for permission. To understand why Doggerland is the most relative topic of 2026, we have to look at the rate of change. In August of 2025, underwater excavations off the coast of Denmark began pulling hazelnut shells and worked wood from a settlement 26 feet below the waves. The archaeologists there, using dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, were able to pinpoint exactly when the coastal forests died. What they found was a rate of sea level rise that mirrors our most aggressive modern projections, nearly 2 meters per century. Imagine your childhood home. Now imagine that by the time your grandchildren are born, the front door is under 6 feet of salt water. This wasn't a great flood that happened in a weekend. It was a generational haunting. The elders of Doggerland would have told stories of the great grasslands to children who only knew salt marshes. They were a people in a permanent state of retreat. But then, 8,200 years ago, the retreat ended, and the whisper became a roar. The reality of Doggerland isn't found in a museum or a palace. It is found in a cylinder of gray, salty mud. In early 2026, at the very bottom of the core, the mud is light and sandy. It contains freshwater silts, the signature of a peaceful inland lake. But as you move your eye up the cylinder, the color shifts. The sand gives way to dark organic peat. This is the transition point. The geochemical analysis released this month confirms that around 10,200 years ago, this specific patch of Doggerland began to suffocate. The oxygen isotopes and carbonate levels recorded in the ELF-19 core show a Goldilocks zone in collapse. The freshwater lake was being invaded by the sea. But it didn't happen as a single wave. The researchers used X-ray fluorescence, a high-tech light that can see the elemental makeup of the mud, to prove that for centuries, the land flickered. It was a saline marsh one year, and a freshwater meadow the next. The people living here were playing a high-stakes game of inches with the North Sea. They were watching the horizon slowly rise, year by year, until the ground beneath their feet was no longer stable enough to hold a home. This chemostratigraphy, this chemical map of the mud, gives us a precision we never had before. We can now date the exact moment when the salt took over, between 10,243 and 10,199 years ago. This is the first time in history we have been able to put a date on the beginning of the end for Europe's lost heartland. It tells us that the whisper of the sinking was a long, slow conversation between the land and the sea. A conversation that eventually turned into a scream. While the Bradford team was mapping the chemistry, a team at the University of Groningen was looking for the ghosts. They used a technique called sedaDNA, sedentary ancient DNA. They weren't looking for bones. They were looking for the microscopic fragments of genetic material left behind by every living thing that touched that mud 10 millennia ago. The findings, updated for 2026, are staggering. In the very layers of mud that show the sea rising, the DNA reveals a refugee ecosystem. We see the DNA of oak and birch trees, a forest that was dying as its roots were poisoned by salt. We see the DNA of wild boars and red deer, animals that were being pushed into smaller and smaller pockets of land as the marshes expanded. And then we see the seagrass. The moment the seagrass DNA appears in the core, the human story of this specific site ends. The forest is gone. The deer are gone. The land bridge is broken. What was once a highway for the first Europeans had become a barrier. And the most terrifying part of the Alpha 19 data isn't just that it happened, it's how fast it happened once the tipping point was reached. If the drowning of Doggerland was a slow tragedy, the Storegga Slide was the violent finale. Imagine an area of the seabed the size of Scotland suddenly letting go. Around 8,200 years ago, on the Norwegian continental margin, 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment collapsed into the abyss. This was the Storegga event. In 2025 and 2026, new simulations from the University of Bradford and Oxford have refined the physics of what happened next. This wasn't just a wave. It was a multi-stage assault on the North Sea basin. The first surge hit the Shetland Islands with a vertical run-up of over 20 meters. By the time it reached the coast of Scotland, the water was still 10 meters high, encroaching nearly 30 kilometers inland. But for Doggerland, which by this point was already a low-lying, fragile landscape of marshes and lagoons, the impact was fundamentally different. The 2026 models showed that the tsunami was guided by the pre-existing topography. It didn't just wash over the land, it surged up the ancient river channels, like the precursor to the river Great Ouse, turning the very veins of the country into conduits for destruction. For a long time, we thought the Storegga tsunami was the final inundation, the moment Doggerland vanished forever. But the February 2026 data suggests something more nuanced and perhaps more haunting. The tsunami didn't sink the land, but it reset it. The high-energy deposits found in core Alpha 19, the rip-up clasts and mixed foraminiferal assemblages, prove the wave hit with immense force. But the paleo-environmental modeling suggests that once the water receded, parts of the landscape actually returned to a version of their pre-tsunami state. Dense woodlands and high ridges acted as natural buffers, absorbing the energy of the surge. However, the whisper had changed. The tsunami had scoured the topsoil, had poisoned the freshwater marshes with salt that wouldn't wash away. It turned a thriving heartland into a scattered, broken archipelago. The 2026 sedaDNA analysis shows a massive drop-off in large mammal DNA immediately following the wave. The red deer and wild boar didn't return in the same numbers. For the Mesolithic people living there, this was a tipping point. The Storegga Slide didn't just kill up to a quarter of the population in the run-in zone. It destroyed the reliability of the land. Imagine being a survivor on the Dogger Bank, now a lone island in a rising sea. You look at the horizon where the land bridge to Europe used to be, and all you see is gray water. The internal lore of these people would have been one of profound displacement. They went from being the masters of Europe's richest hunting grounds to refugees on shrinking islands, waiting for a tide that was never going to go back out. This is the lesson of 1200 BCE and 6200 BCE combined. Civilizations don't always end with a total wipeout. Sometimes they end because the systems they depend on, the fresh water, the migrating herds, the stable ground, are simply removed. By 5,000 years ago, even the islands were gone. The Dogger Bank became a shoal. The people were gone. And the great silence of the North Sea began. The greatest mistake we make when looking at Doggerland is thinking of it as a failure. We treat it like a prehistoric Atlantis, a world that simply lacked the technology to save itself. But the 2026 data from the ELFO-19 core tells a different story. It tells us that for over 2,000 years, the people of the North Sea Basin were the most successful and adaptable population in Europe. They didn't just sink, they pivoted. They shifted their hunting grounds. They redesigned their tools. They lived through a rate of sea level rise that would paralyze a modern city in weeks. The signature of the sinking we found in the mud this year shows us that the final disappearance of Doggerland was uncaused by a lack of human intelligence. It was caused by the sheer, relentless pace of the physical world changing faster than a society could move. As we stand here in 2026, the parallels are no longer subtle. The 1 meter per century rise recorded in the North Sea peats is no longer a historical curiosity. It is the exact high-end projection for our own global sea levels by the year 2150. But there is a fundamental difference between us and the hunter-gatherers of the North Sea. The people of Doggerland were mobile. When the salt marshes moved, they moved. They didn't have billions of dollars in fiber optic cables, nuclear power plants, or mega cities anchored to the coastline. They were light. We are heavy. We have built our entire global civilization on the assumption that the coastline is a permanent line on a map. The 2026 findings from the University of Bradford serve as a digital chain of custody for a hard truth. Nature does not respect the lines we draw. Storegga Slide showed us that a tipping point can turn a slow retreat into a catastrophic surge in a single afternoon. Today, as we watch the rapid warming in the Arctic and the instability of the polar ice sheets, we are watching the same physics that silenced Doggerland begin to prime themselves once again. History is not a straight line. It is a cycle of whispers and roars. The whisper of Doggerland is found in the DNA of a dying oak tree trapped in the mud. The roar is the sound of the North Sea reclaiming a country that was once the heart of a continent. If we want to avoid becoming the next whisper for a future archaeologist to find, we have to start listening to the data. We have to understand that our interconnection, our global systems, are only as strong as the ground they are built on. The people of the North Sea left no books. They left no statues. But they left a signature in the dust and the mud that says, "We were here. We saw it coming. We tried." Thank you for joining me in the deep waters today. Please subscribe to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore, so you never miss an episode. Want to hear from you. If the water started rising tomorrow, what is the one piece of internal lore? The one part of your culture you would fight to save first? So let me know in the comments. Until the next whisper, stay curious and stay safe.